The Cuyahoga County Committee of the Whole meeting for Tuesday, July 2nd, 2024 is now called to order. Andrea, would you please call the roll?
Good afternoon, everyone. It is now 3:03 p.m., and as a reminder to all in attendance, this meeting is being recorded and live streamed on the county's YouTube page. Calling the roll, Mr. Gallagher. Mr. Schron is absent. Ms. Conwell.
Present.
Ms. Turner. Ms. Turner is absent at the moment. Ms. Stevens is absent. Ms. Simon is absent at the moment. Mr. Kelly.
Here.
Mr. Miller.
Present.
Mr. Sweeney.
Present.
Mr. Byrne.
Here.
Council President Jones.
Here.
You have a quorum.
Thank you, Andrea. If you read our next item into the record. I'd take that back. Is there anyone signed in for public
I
comment?
was just going to say, no public comment has been received.
All right.
And items referred to committee. Ordinance 2024-0005. Ordinance amending Chapter 501 of the Cuyahoga County Code and declaring the necessity that this ordinance become immediately effective.
All right, and I believe
Council
Yeah.
President, I'm sorry. Just got one. We have Daniel Perlman for public comment. And for the record, Ms. Turner is in attendance.
No, there's a button right below your microphone.
Got it. Okay, perfect. Good afternoon. Thank you. My name is Daniel Perlman. I'm a resident of Beechwood. I would like to thank County Council for withdrawing the anti-Israel divestment resolution just over 2 weeks ago that employed the decades-old tactic of the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement that looks to fatally injure the Jewish state through financial and economic means. I deeply appreciate your listening to the concerns of Cuyahoga County residents who believe Cuyahoga County Council should be focused on the well-being of the residents of the county and not entertaining efforts that seek to further divide our community. I understand that the co-sponsors of the previous resolution have threatened to introduce a new resolution that calls for the divestment of all foreign securities. From my understanding, Israel is the only foreign investment the county holds, so it would have the same result in a different package. Any attempt to pursue prohibitions on foreign investments is a poorly veiled attempt at the same policy. As such, I and thousands of other county residents ask you to please oppose any such effort. Last week, the City Club of Cleveland hosted a forum titled Voices of Cleveland's Palestinian Community. Both panelists, including one who has become a familiar face at recent county council meetings, did not condemn the October 7th attacks, did not refer to Hamas as a terrorist organization, and did not recognize the over 10,000 rockets launched by Palestinian terrorists at Israeli civilians since October 7th. On the contrary, this person insisted that, quote, resistance is legitimate, end quote, and engaged in Holocaust distortion by comparing Hamas's armed uprising, bloodthirsty terrorist attack, to the Warsaw Ghetto uprising. She also announced opposition to a two-state solution, seeking to erase the Jewish right to self-determination under any borders, and equated Israeli civilian hostages held in Gaza, many of whom have been sexually abused and tortured, with Palestinian prisoners in Israeli jails, often for planning or executing deadly terrorist attacks. This person is just one of dozens who, through lies and intimidation tactics, are trying to pressure council to adopt a discriminatory resolution under the guise of justice, when in reality, justice could not be farther from the truth. Please stay strong and do not give into the extreme minority. Thank you again for your accessibility, thoughtfulness, and engagement as public servants, and happy 4th of July.
Paul?
Good afternoon, Council President Jones, members of council. Thanks again for the opportunity to continue the discussion on our recommended revisions to Chapter 501 of the County Code. Our last discussion focused
Paul, if you could state your name for the record.
Yes, sorry. Paul Porter, Director of the Department of Purchasing. Our last conversation focused largely on the threshold for county council approval, and I want to take this opportunity to emphasize some of the other changes to Section 501 that we believe will make it easier for vendors to do business with the county, which is my overall goal as director of the Department of Purchasing. We're recommending increasing the maximum threshold for informal bids from $50,000 to $250,000, alongside extending the minimum time period for informal bids from 8 hours to 3 business days in order to allow vendors additional time to respond. We also plan to require departments to notify any registered SBE, MBE, and WBE vendors who have registered with our Department of Equity and Inclusion of any solicitation, that they can provide the good or service for based on their registration. That policy is going to apply to purchases above $5,000. We propose raising the threshold for Board of Control approval to $25,000 from the current $5,000 threshold, and that $25,000 is still lower than or equal to several peers throughout the state of Ohio. For instance, $25,000 in Summit County, $50,000 in Montgomery County, and $100,000 in Hamilton County. Those are kind of the thresholds that they require some sort of legislative approval for a transaction. We recommend reducing the complexity and repetition within the code as written by standardizing language and codifying our current business practices into the code. Examples of this include emphasizing RFPs, or requests for proposals, as well as requests for qualifications alongside RFBs as, valid, acceptable methods of solicitation. The current code emphasizes requests for bid as preferable above RFPs or RFQs, but there are many scenarios when the county is soliciting goods or services where a request for proposals or requests for qualifications makes more sense than just looking at the lowest and best bidder by doing an RFB. Our recommendations acknowledge the roles of both council and the executive as partners in the procurement and contracting process. These recommendations are designed to pursue efficiencies and oversight, as well as just making our current practices simpler wherever possible. That includes during solicitation and award when departments are working with vendors, and during the review and approval process by either the Board of Control or County Council. Council maintains 3 seats on the Board of Control, and the representatives of council who attend those meetings ask questions both at the meeting and ahead of time, and have a high level of engagement on those agenda items brought forward to the Board of Control for approval. Our recommendations also preserve the ability of the council president to move items from the Board of Control to County Council, an option that's been exercised at several different points in the past, including recently with a strategic planning item. I appreciated the feedback that council members gave during our initial discussion about the nature of the contract or purchase perhaps having more to do with who should approve it than what the dollar amount of the contract or purchase is. Chief Gallagher emphasized steps that we've taken in addition to these recommendations to improve our processes, and we continue to take those steps on a daily basis, whether that's increasing the frequency of training, assessing strengths and areas for improvement across different departments, extracting data from the ERP to determine where improvements are needed, and challenging departments to start processes earlier. We're doing it, but that's only part of the equation. Following up on the question of payment timeliness that was brought up at the last meeting, a thorough analysis of items approved by County Council during 2023 and 2024 indicated an average duration between the date of approval and the date a check was cut as approximately 90 days, with a median of 79 days. Keep in mind that that includes items that may get approved by council prior to the start date. For instance, something that gets approved in November or December and doesn't start till January, and we might not expect to receive an invoice from the vendor until the end of the month of January or early in February. Looking at just the time from receipt of an invoice to the processing of the payment and a check being cut, In 2021 and 2022, we were sitting at 39 days for that. And then 2023 and 2024, it looks more like an average of 34 days. So we've shaved 5 days off that process between 21 and 22, and now the current stats of 23 and 24. And our median time for processing invoices is just 2 weeks, 15 days. And that includes receiving the invoice, the appropriate authority within a department reviewing and approving the invoice, and then all the steps it has to go through to get approved by accounts payable in the ERP before the actual check is cut. In short, again, we're doing what we can on our end to make processes efficient, timely, make sure vendors get their checks, and make sure they're authorized to deliver goods and services. We look forward to partnering with you to identify where we can make improvements, and I hope to get some additional feedback today on how we can improve this process as partners together. Thank you.
Right. Are there any questions? Who would like to go first?
Oh, you're the senior, go ahead. Just a quick question. It seems like quite a jump, quite a leap, threshold from 75,000 to 250,000. How'd you determine the threshold of 250,000?
So when we looked at the changes that the state of Ohio made, which was to increase from 50,000 to 75,000 at the end of last year, which is separate from our current threshold of 50,000, we haven't increased it to be in line with the state yet. We looked at a provision that the state gave themselves to go up to 250,000 on construction projects. I understand that many of the projects the state undertakes may be larger in scope than our projects. However, if you're looking at, the difference in the number of 250,000 versus 50,000 or $75,000 solicitations we do, I would question whether the, type of projects the state's doing, repaving an interstate, for instance, a lot of those aren't likely to be at that lower dollar amount between 75 and 250,000. And looking at where we are with our projects, it felt like 250,000 was a better landing point after we analyzed the number of formals versus informals that we complete. In addition to that, our informal process is typically more stringent than the informal processes undertaken by some of our peers. For instance, at lower dollar amounts, some of our peers still use kind of more of a quotation system instead of a system like we use, where we require multiple efforts if we get, 1 or 2 responses on an informal. So in some cases, particularly compared to peers throughout the state of Ohio, our informal process looks more like their formal process. The biggest difference being that our formals are open for 30 days, and we're recommending that informals be open for 3 business days. Does that help? Thanks.
Councilman Miller?
Mr. President, Director, I know that still from time to time we get contracts that come in late, and the question I have is whether this is a matter of there just being too many contracts to process and too many to keep up with, or is it a matter of the process of coordinate everything not being sufficiently efficient, but that in practice it should be manageable?
Sure. I think it's a combination. An example I'll use is something that's going to come forward on the 16th to council, awards for the Universal Pre-K program. I think this time around, and don't quote me, I'll have to pull the total number of proposals and the statistics to give you the exact number. But I think we had something like 111 proposals, which is head and shoulders above what we've gotten in the past. it's tough to anticipate kind of the volume of proposals that you're going to get. Sometimes we do a solicitation and only get 2 or 3 responses. That's an example of an outlier on the high end. And the department may have planned to do that solicitation 7 or 8 months in advance, and they find themselves running up against the clock just based on the number of proposals that came in. So I would say that, you know, the training that we're offering to departments, the emphasis that we're putting on starting early as much as possible is our way of trying to avoid those late contracts. There's always going to be some contracts that come forward late due to the nature of their funding. Federally funded contracts and state funded contracts are a good example of that. I can think of the reclaim funded contracts that are juvenile court team processes, as well as some of the HUD funded contracts that Office of Homeless Services processes. There's not really a way for us to speed up that state and federal process. So we're kind of left asking, what can we do to speed up the award process on our end, the approval process, and then ultimately the payment process? I'll point to when we were pulling the statistics on payment timeliness, some of our homeless shelter payments that went out within 2 days of receiving the invoice. That's because maybe it took us 4 or 5 months to get, you know, the federal funding from the dates the Fed sent us a letter or notice of that funding, and we started working on either an amendment or award. As soon as that money hit our budget, we were processing a check to get that vendor paid. Scenarios like that, I don't know, you know, this isn't going to be a silver bullet to fix it. It's just going to kind of shorten both the solicitation process on the front end and then the approval process when it comes forward to either council or board of control for approval.
So, Mr. President, Director, I'm aware that with some of the reclaim and some of the HUD grants that you don't even get the notice of the award until after the supposed start date.
Correct.
You know, so I usually don't even ask too many questions about them. I know that that problem is out there. My other question is what your assessment is of what the impact would be of increasing the threshold for informal bidding on our ability to attract more minority participation. I could see it both ways. I could see it that the formal bidding process, you could have benefits from the formal processes that guarantee procedures to ensure full access, but the informal bidding could benefit from the fact that it's a shorter process. There's usually less paperwork involved, and it's easier for contractors to complete a bid, and so I'm interested in your assessment on what the impact will be.
I have to say your understanding is spot on. You took the words out of my mouth related to making it easier for vendors to respond. When we looked at the impact on the number of formals versus informals, if we raise the threshold, it would result in approximately 1/4 of what was formal bids last year switching to informal. And the goal, both with extending the time period that informals are required to be out on the streets and raising that threshold to make it easier for vendors to respond, is to try and get new vendors that we aren't working with, minority-owned vendors, women-owned businesses, and small businesses to be able to respond without some of the rigmarole of formals. And I would be remiss if I didn't mention the efforts that we're undertaking right now to overhaul our formal solicitation process, both kind of the outward-facing piece of our solicitation portal, which is part of the ERP system, looking at, you know, can we do proposal solicitation or bid solicitation as more of a fillable form that vendors could just come onto our website, fill in several different fields and then submit their proposal instead of having to print out the documents, type something up, hand sign something. There are other things that we're looking at aside from just these recommendations to make it easier for vendors to do business with the county. When the Plain Dealer did their article last fall, there were numerous different things that vendors mentioned as barriers, including the cumbersome nature of the paperwork and process associated with bidding on county business. So we're looking at how do we make it easier, and making more things informal rather than formal is kind of one tool in our toolbox for that.
Thank you, Mr. President.
Well, Director Porter, you said it, just to follow up on Councilman Miller's comment, this is a partnership. Obviously, we're looking at things that the administration believes should be done on the legislative side. I still have deep concerns about giving up oversight. I'll just have to say that from the start. Giving up oversight for many of these changes. But if it is a partnership, I also want, and I was hoping from these 2 weeks to today, we'd hear also the actual changes. Like you've spoken to them, the formal bidding process, instead of necessarily just use the word, doing an end around it for informal, to in the formal, why aren't you making those changes? Or tell us about the changes that you are going to make the documentation easier, better marketing, whatever it might be. Those things, tell us what the administration is doing to find that silver bullet, as we talked about. If there is no silver bullet, again, it's challenging to think about giving up oversight. But if we find the silver bullet, then that is a win-win for the community and for the vendors and for everyone. So I also want to hear the substantive changes that the administration is making, because we've all gotten calls from vendors, and the vendors say, hey, I haven't gotten my check. But I have to say, in 14 years, what I haven't heard them say is, when are those 3 readings going to be up? They don't say that. So if I'm not hearing 3 readings are up, and I'm hearing, then again, it speaks that there's an element on your side where, to be good partners, we need to hear, not we're looking at it, but what are you going to do? Because you've already said here what we're supposed to do, or at least what you feel we should do. But I need to see an equal amount of weight from the administrative side.
Point well taken, and one thing I would emphasize, it's coming right up after your next council meeting. I think it's Thursday, July 18th. We're having an additional vendor fair, and those are designed to put departments in the same room as vendors to talk about upcoming opportunities to do business with the county. Again, we're not looking at this on its own as what's going to be the fix. And I mean, the thresholds, the oversight, that's part of it. But we're looking at changing, language to standardize things, not to remove oversight. There's a variety of other changes that we've proposed to the county code that don't specifically relate to dollar amounts and thresholds. And, to address your point about vendors not asking council about 3 readings, those are the questions they ask us. As I mentioned, the time distance between council approval and a check being cut is typically longer because we can't tell vendors to start work under a contract until you guys have approved either the contract or an amendment. There are many cases where if it's an ongoing service, out-of-home care for Division of Children and Family Services, where we've got kids placed in facilities throughout the county, the state, and the rest of the country, we're not going to tell them that at 12:01 a.m. January 1st, if the contract hasn't been approved, that they can't deliver those services. But understand from the vendor's perspective the time-sensitive nature of getting the approval and having the contract in place, signed, and executed so that they can be assured that we're going to pay them for services after we get the invoice. I'll emphasize that when we get an invoice, our typical turnaround time is 15 days. A median turnaround time is 15 days between the date of the invoice and the date an actual check is cut. Not the date of approval, not the date the director signs off, but the date an actual check is cut. I think a 2-week turnaround is fairly good, whether you look at the private sector, nonprofit, and especially the government sector. And I'm pleased that we've been able to cut off 5 days from the average processing time, that 39 days down to 34 days. We are emphasizing to departments that there is work that they have to do as part of this as well. I think I mentioned at the end of our last discussion, there are some departments that these changes would benefit that I'm not particularly popular with, because I give them a hard time when they're coming forward with late items or items where the paperwork's not in order. I got to tell you, though, if the concern is accountability and I tell a department, well, we're not going to put this on the next council meeting, who does that penalize? Doesn't penalize the department. Those staff get paid no matter what. The penalty is on the vendor and on the residents of the county that may have a delay in getting an approved contract in place. So that's where it's a balance between training departments, making sure they've got the tools and skills they need to get contracts submitted timely, and us sending stuff to council to be on an agenda as executive sponsored items. You know, I'm going to be the last person standing in line saying, no, I don't want this contract to go forward, because that's not how I feel about things. I try not to get hung up on process for the sake of just focusing on process and missing out on the outcome. The outcome is making it easier for vendors to do business with us, and in turn, getting county residents the services that they deserve from the county by us being efficient and effective in processing contracts, purchase orders, payments, loans, any number of different things. So I hear you, and it's not as if we are not emphasizing on the executive side all the different things that go into making contracts and purchases happen. By the time an item gets to county council, there are cases where departments have been working with vendors for months. I can say when I was on the Health and Human Services side, sometimes when you're working with a nonprofit and there's a hang up like, appropriate cyber insurance coverage, you can be going back and forth 2, 3, 4 weeks at a time. Even with the item that just came to Board of Control on Monday for armed guard and armored truck pickup services, that was an item that I directly assisted with that we started working on. I think it was last September we had outreach from a vendor. They wanted us to use their legal template. Our law department had changes. Their law department had changes. And the end result is something that we wanted to start January 1. We didn't end up getting a contract in place until July 1. There's only so much you can do with that, and I'm expressing my individual frustration having worked directly on that one. Departments in general are trying to turn around transactions as quickly as possible. You know, we're in construction season right now. Public Works has been working hard to close out requests for bid and get contracts in place for construction projects throughout the county. This is important stuff, but it's not like you can just say, okay, the bid closed yesterday at 11 a.m. We're ready to submit paperwork to council tomorrow. There's a thorough document collection and review process that has to occur before that. And often when you're working with vendors that have, a law department of their own, that can be a holdup. So departments are working hard to get council and the Board of Control items that they can approve. It's not as if they're not doing their part. Is there room for improvement? Absolutely. But should that preclude, taking a look at these recommendations and streamlining the code where possible? I don't think so.
This time, Councilwoman Conwell. Oh, I thought you had a question. Okay.
I wrote down one. Through the chair to Mr. Porter, if council agrees to make changes to this legislative side, as you're putting forth to us today, is it still going to go through the proper departments to be signed off on, and in the order that it should be signed off on?
That would be my preference. If the question is related to the occasion of items being presented to council prior to execution, I can't say that that would never happen, or I'm sorry, prior to review by the purchasing department. I can't say that that would never happen. There are examples of transactions like CDSG and CDBG where we get federal funds, we get notice of the federal funds and put the award recommendations forward to council prior to actually having the agreements. So those take time afterwards. Some of our loans are like that. And I continue to support what departments are asking for related to multi-vendor master agreements and trying to get kind of an award recommendation approved by council as they're working through document collection, insurance issues, any number of delays on behalf of the vendor. Again, if we wait until every one out of 45 vendors on a master agreement has all of their paperwork in order, the 45th party is not the one injured by that delay. It's the first, second, and third parties that had all their paperwork together in a timely fashion that had to wait for the one at the end of the line to get their paperwork done. So I'm pleased that we've been able to work with some departments to, try kind of an award recommendation approach that then the vendors who have everything done on time can have their portion of the contract executed, and the only vendors that are awaiting execution and payment are those that have delays of their own.
Yes, we talked about that. Administrator Merriman, one of the directors of HHS, we talked about that at our last meeting last week. And so there are other ways. There's language that can be put in for those master contracts. Now, remember, administration years ago came to us about master contracts and how easy and quick it would be. And so we agreed to that. And now it seems that master contracts are having some issues of their own. So my second question would be, we've always had, county is very large. And so we have always had issues with oversight and what that oversight should look like, how in-depth it should be. And I think we've, council on this side has stepped up to the plate more and more about oversight. So if council, back to my first initial statement, if council agrees to make changes to this legislative side, what oversight do you plan to have for all these threshold increases and all this?
So we would look at the same level of review for items that are going to Board of Control and County Council as exists right now. We're not looking to make changes for that. The biggest change would be giving departments, greater spending authority at a lower dollar amount, and then increasing the transaction level that just goes to the Department of Purchasing for review and then gets reported out, on a report that previously was included in the written agenda for Board of Control on a monthly basis. We're trying to cut down on paper and have that be a separate PDF available as a link within that electronic agenda and then posted to the website. That report would continue to reflect, under our recommended changes, any purchases, in this case, instead of from 1 to 5,000, we would do it from 1,000 to 25,000. So council would be able to see those transactions and ask questions about them, and that has occurred. Again, it would be after the fact, but whether we consider the county large, small, the level of business that we do, there are many smaller municipalities within Cuyahoga County that exercise significantly higher thresholds for department purchasing ability and, purchasing department approval or executive approval than what we have. So the recommendations are kind of to get us more in line, if not slightly lower than in line with some of our peers. And I'm not sure, based on our recommendations, if this results in significantly lower oversight. And the example I would use related to Board of Control versus council approving it, I talked about the purchase of vehicles last time around and how if we were buying multiple vehicles and it was 750,000, as the code is written right now, it would have to go to county council, not Board of Control. I'm curious to see whether you think there would be like a substantive reason to have, thorough analysis and debate potentially by county council on a standard vehicle purchase, or if considering the nature of the purchase maybe is better than looking at just the dollar amount of what should be approved by Board of Control versus council.
For Board of Control, it did not even have to exist if it was not for us. We could have saw everything if we wanted to, but we knew that there would be a time that the county would need to make some emergency purchases, that you couldn't galvanize all 11 of us at any given time. So we put in, I feel, safety nets for things that have happened. And this is nothing new. Every administration has tried to monkey with the thresholds that have been in place since the beginning of time. I don't know if it's right or wrong. We're here to listen to what you think about it. But I know in HHS, this is not gonna fly with me in terms of the threshold increases. Because I've even seen some contracts or some things that individuals may need, and they know they have to meet that threshold. The contract is actually over and needs to come to us. It's been presented at different times to Board of Control, so it wouldn't have to go in front of all of us. So I've seen the games that have been played, and so I'm just here to listen today and to share what I have observed personally over the years. And I guess another question, I just, looking at the original legislation, just maybe you can explain to me why contracts were taken out. Everywhere the word contract was taken out and inserted in its place was transactions. So could you explain to me why that was a necessity instead of the verbiage contracts and transactions?
Certainly. That's an example of trying to standardize language where the code before specified, contract, purchase, lease, agreement, a variety of different languages. My recommendation with that is just trying to streamline it as much as possible. There are sometimes questions of where does this item go or that item go based on the nature of the transaction under the current county code. And my goal would be, by changing the language to transaction, would have a contract be treated equivalently to a purchase. The only thing that we're treating differently with the recommendations is real estate transactions, and that's based on initial feedback from county council when we were exploring these changes, that council feels a greater need for oversight of real estate transactions. And I hear your point about, there was a threshold change mostly at the lower dollar amount in 2019, and the top threshold was not changed then. That 500,000 has been set, since the introduction of, what has to go to county council versus, I think at the time, contracts and purchasing board, and now just the Board of Control. That hasn't been adjusted, and, these are recommendations that are undertaken by talking to a variety of different departments. This is, I would say less an administration goal and more, we took a detailed analysis of what departments think, and this isn't, the executive's office saying, well, I think we need to change this, I think we need to change that. A lot of this is driven by the purchasing department and the staff within various departments that are making these contracts and purchases.
Yeah, but this is something that the departments kind of shared with the administration. You know, they got one point of view that the departments need this kind of change. And they're new. Honestly, they're new, and they don't know how some of this stuff has done in the past. I don't think I agree with the word transaction, so I want to ask the law director, is that a big distinction of taking the word contracts out and inserting transactions all the way? Because transactions can be a lot of things. To me, contracts kind of establish that there's a certain kind of requirement to it. So I give that to you, Mr. Law Director.
And through the president, I would invite Jared Zibratowski, Chief Counsel for Transactions and Contracts, to address that question specifically. He's looked into that.
I just want to squeeze one question in. Director Porter, you mentioned, tell us the name of some of those departments or agencies you said that kind of driven us to this point from what you saw from their experience and what they brought to you.
Certainly. So we solicited feedback from multiple departments across the county. That includes Health and Human Services, that includes Public Works, that includes Public Safety and Justice Services, Department of Development. We really looked all over the county for feedback on this. And some of it, frankly, is driven by my personal experience working in the Department of Health and Human Services. It's a challenge. Contracting and doing purchases for the county is a challenge, no matter which way you slice it. We're just trying to make it easier if we can.
Thank you. The floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you for the question. This is Jared Zibratowski, Chief Counsel from the Law Department. Transactions is a defined term. We're moving away from multiple listings of contracts, sale, purchase, grant. And the reason that we're doing that is to remain consistent throughout the entire chapter. There are instances where, you know, a certain type of transaction, a contract, may be treated differently than a purchase, may be treated differently than a grant. So by defining the term transaction, which includes contracts, we're setting the same levels for each one of those to make sure that we're capturing them. So rather than, well, is this a purchase agreement? Is this a contract? They're all transactions. So the idea is to make it more simple. So when you see transactions throughout as an added term, that includes contracts. It also would include a grant. It would also include a purchase.
I understand the use of the word transaction, but does it in some kind of way hurt the validity of the word contract or what we plan on doing? Because we enter into contracts with individuals.
I guess I don't understand the question of hurting the validity. The word transaction contains and still means contract in this instance. So
Okay, it just means a whole bunch of other things.
yes, it does. It means all those other things that it's defined as at 501.02A1.
Thank you.
There was Councilman Gallagher and then Councilwoman Sunny Simon.
Thanks, Paul. It seems this is seemingly being driven by upset vendors that are not getting paid on time. I guess that's the easy way to put it. Do you have a list of those vendors that have walked away from Cuyahoga County and refused to do business with us because of lack of timely payment as they saw it?
I do not have a list of those vendors in particular. This is more based on feedback from vendors that, you know, it takes too long to do business with us. Not that they're walking away from doing business with us, but that maybe they're not submitting a bid or proposal, even though they could perform the work, because they don't want to go through the process of, you know, taking weeks or months to get an award determination and enter into a contract. There's not a specific vendor or vendors that have reached out to me directly on this. And I am more than happy to take a look at specific instances where constituents or companies or nonprofits within your various council districts have reached out about slow payment, about the length of time an award is taking, and, you know, kind of assess and analyze where things could have gone better in that process. because our goal is to get more vendors who want to do business with the county.
Well, I guess the answer to my question is those vendors don't exist. People are standing in line to do work with the county. We all know that. And it seems as though that there's a problem. And you're bringing the problem to the area where there isn't a problem. If necessary, we'll suspend readings. That saves, what, 30, 40 days? You're talking about saving 5 days? So I'm going to save 40 days by hearing your concerns or a vendor's concern. So I've shaved off 30 days, let's say. And you're talking about, say, changing all kinds of stuff to save 5 days. For vendors that are concerned about getting paid on time, that continue to come back to do work for the county. And I understand it's a burden at times, and we deal with that. We do deal with that. We hear about it. We sometimes get the calls. It's not a lot. So I'm wondering what the global reason for all of this is, because you're dancing around the reason and the rationale, and I don't get it. And you're kind of bogarting our time here. Why don't you just spit it out, tell me what this is all about, because it isn't vendors that aren't getting paid and not coming back.
I believe I introduced in the last discussion kind of a personal element to my feelings about the article that Cleveland.com wrote.
I mean, we do not live and die by Cleveland.com. And quite honestly, Cleveland.com is not a friend of anybody up here. And starting with me, and they know it. And I read their stuff only to make sure I read their stuff so no one else has to. So what's the administration's position for this? Not Cleveland.com. If we're going to knee-jerk because of Cleveland.com, I could tell you some horror stories that didn't happen.
Is it Cleveland.com, or is it the vendors telling Cleveland.com that they don't want to do business with the county because of
Isn't
this,
that a
and the
shame
other?
that a vendor would go to Cleveland.com? I don't want to do business with somebody that goes to the media saying that they're not getting paid on time, where in fact, we don't even know if they're not getting paid on time. That was a bad tactic with me, I'll tell you right now. Because that vendor I don't want to do business with. And if there is a problem, I'd like to get to where the problem is. And the problem is not in these 11 seats. It's not. It's not. Every time the administration, this one or the two previous, requests that this council move expeditiously, we have.
You asked for kind of a better distillation maybe of what I'm asking about, and if we want to talk
How about the real reason?
specifically about the thresholds, if you want to hear from me why we're asking about the thresholds, it's because in Montgomery County, somebody can get an approval in 1 to 2 weeks. In Lucas County, somebody can get an approval regardless of dollar amount in 2 to 3 weeks. Hamilton County, 2 to 3 weeks. Franklin County, 2.5 to 4 weeks. Summit County, 4 weeks.
Okay,
I
did
believe
any of those counties have one of the largest corruption scams going in the history of the United States of America? No. We have. We're once bit and definitely twice shy. And we're very careful. I will not say what I caught once, one time, through a contract that was being driven. I won't say it, but I could prove it. And that they went away and they never came back. They never came back because somebody was driving a contract. We had a guy go to prison over in that jail, not necessarily just because of the jail. He was trying to steer contracts too. He didn't even get hit on that one. So we're very touchy about that, as we should be. And we're not perfect. Sure. But I'm wondering where this is all coming from when you're coming to us for this. And I'd still like to hear the name of the company that went to the plain dealer. I know you wouldn't know that. I know you wouldn't know that.
Good afternoon, Katie Gallagher from the Executive Office. I just want to jump in because I kind of feel like there's some darts being thrown at Paul right now, and I don't really think that's fair. As Paul already mentioned, this is a collection effort by a lot of the fiscal staff, and we have a tremendous amount of terrific fiscal staff that work here. They were not part of county corruption. We have moved away from the county corruption, and I hope that these are really high-quality workers. We do have mistakes. We live in an organization of human beings. There are going to be mistakes. I'm not going to promise you're going to have everything perfect all the time. But what I don't want to do is discourage employees from presenting their best efforts to improve the county. And so when they stand up here and have a difficult time of explaining things and just try to improve how we work this organization, I applaud them. I applaud the fact that these employees got together and they were putting good ideas in front of you. And this is one of them, one of many. So let's not discourage our employees from coming up here and trying to improve our organization because of something that happened 15 years ago.
You know, I'll respond to that. And I take a little bit of an affront to that. If you're going to come in front of this body, we're going to grill you. We grilled every administration, every one, and we become the bad guys. But we've saved this county numerous times. And you're asking us to do something based on what I don't know. I guess now, an article in the Plain Dealer. And the reason we are here is because of county corruption. I didn't say anything about him or anybody else. We've got to be careful here. And we're asking, I think, legitimate questions. And if this is about an article in the Plain Dealer, shame on you.
It is not the position that I am taking that the county executive has done this for an article in the paper. I am much like you. I can care very little what Cleveland.com has to say personally. But I did take this job because I would like to see the county do better. I would like to see this organization do better. And so I truly believe that the fiscal staff that sat in a room and put a whole bunch of policy ideas together and continue to try to improve this county because they care about this county. And I'm not saying that you don't care about this county, but this is one of the areas where we feel that could improve the county. Yes, we've moved towards a county council regime because of county corruption. But in doing so, we've created an organization that by nature of the fact that it's a council is automatically going to create extra time in the process because county commissioners meet weekly and council meets every other week. It's the nature. It's not a blame game. It's not saying you're doing it on purpose. It's the nature of the structure of the organization as a byproduct of the county corruption.
Well, you're balancing everything on that. I'm balancing your presentation here as not really being prepared to answer exactly why we're doing this, other than these are suggestions that we're making. I'd like to know what time we're going to be saving. I've heard 5 days. I just saved you 30. 30.
Well, the one thing that we can't adjust for is the fact that you are one council. Just as if people say, well, we put these protections in place because we could have an executive that may make different decisions. An example of that is just a conversation Monday we've had about classified and unclassified. Well, a next county executive, if we don't have a process or procedure in place, could make more staff unclassified. Well, your position is, well, we could suspend the rules and we could make something go faster just by going one reading. Well, a next council that may come in may not have the same position. They may say, well, you know, we want to go full 3 readings on everything. So that's an individual choice. That may not always be the case. And I'll let Paul say what he says.
So let me say this, Chief Gallagher, this is not personal.
Yeah.
This is us doing our job. And the questions are tough. They can be tough, but it's not personal. But whether we like the answers or not, or whether we get the answer we want, it's not personal. Efficiency and effectiveness is the balance that we've been working on for 14 years. And efficiency does not automatically come if we're not sure that we're still going to be effective. So there's a balancing act. That's why I like the way Councilman Conwell said, we're listening. We want to hear, but there's a lot of experience on this council over the time that we've been here that makes us have pause. So we want to give you that opportunity to share. You just have to accept it might be tough, but it's not personal. So with that, and I'm also going to say this because this is going to stay in committee because we have a lot more to dig into. But I do want all of my colleagues to, I'm going to let you comment, but I need to get to my colleagues as well before we end. And I want to stop at 4, but I'm going to give us a few minutes to be able to let everyone speak. So if you want to take a brief response, and then we're going to let Councilwoman Simon speak.
I don't mind questions, tough or otherwise. I've attempted to give good answers about the justification for these changes. It takes too long to do business with the county, period. I will emphatically state that. Whatever the question is, it takes too long. We can do better, and the approval process is part of that. We often waive the second reading, which saves approximately 2 weeks. And Councilman Gallagher, you mentioned the 5-day statistic. That's a reduction in average invoice processing time that's already happened. That was 21, 22 compared to 23 and 24. What we are asking for is to completely slash the timeline for items between $500,000 and $1.5 million. It affects a small portion of the county's business. We're not recommending, we can't recommend changes to the first, second, third reading because that's actually part of the charter, not part of the county code. So we can't recommend those changes. What we're looking at is the items that are subject to council review and approval, looking at the thresholds for those. And bottom line, this is about making it easier for vendors to do business with the county.
Okay, thank you. Councilwoman Simon.
Just wanted to follow up, thank you. With regard to the threshold statement you made, you said that the threshold is important to change because other counties comparatively get these contracts approved and apparently paid, or just approved within 1 to 3 weeks. You mentioned different counties. What's that, the weekly period?
That's
represent?
approval and execution.
Okay.
So that's when you can have,
Okay.
a draft contract and get it
Okay,
executed.
so this council is along those lines. If we get something introduced today at a council meeting, it goes to committee next week. If it's something important that requires expediency, we always, without doubt, suspend. Then it would come back the second week and it would get approved. That's 2 weeks, right?
Correct.
Yes. And then that's commensurate with the counties that you just stated are better or work faster than us. So I have to tell you that argument doesn't fly with me. The problem is, once we approve the contract, within 1 to 2 weeks, maybe 3, it's up to you to pay that timely. So I don't understand either where this problem lies.
The one thing I would add is that doesn't take into account the advance time that council asks us to submit contracts for inclusion on an agenda. We typically have between 3 and 2.5 week lead time for departments to have their item reviewed by purchasing before it gets forwarded to council for inclusion on an agenda.
Okay, so I'm going to stop you right there. So you're saying now that it's council's fault that you are getting the contracts through the process, not oversight by the council, but going into getting your contracts in on time.
I'm just trying to indicate what the actual council approval timeline is.
No, that's not council approval. I have to interrupt you. That's not council approval. That's your administration job to get those contracts to where they need to go before they come to us. The oversight that we are here to implement has nothing to do with you getting contracts to someplace to be looked at, to go through a pipeline. And if you got them in sooner, they'd get to us sooner, right?
In theory, yes. But again, when we're comparing apples to apples, the timelines that I mentioned for those counties are when they go on to a commissioner's agenda, like when it's a draft agreement.
And we said that. When it
gets
comes to
approved.
our agenda, today, for example, we have contracts. Those will go to committee next week. They may or may not be suspended if you ask us or your department heads ask us. We always do it unless there's, it's unreasonable request. And then it comes back in another week. That's 2 weeks. So you are addressing us where we actually are right on target with a commissioner structure. I think where the problem you're describing lies is before it even comes to our agenda. So I want to make that clear. If there's a problem in expediency on your end, maybe you need to speed up that process, but that has nothing to do with a threshold or coming to us because we execute and approve contracts within the same time frame that the comparative commissioners do that. I think unequivocally. So I think unequivocally, but go ahead.
With due respect, commissioners typically approve things on a single reading, like they don't have to go
But you told me it
multiple
takes
readings
2 to
how we
3
do.
weeks going through a commissioner process.
Correct. From the date the department submits a
Okay.
draft, not the date it appears on
So
a
maybe you need to
commissioner's
get your
agenda.
drafts in sooner. Okay, that's number one.
Regardless of when we get a
Okay, so
draft in.
the problem doesn't lie when it comes to us. The problem lies somewhere that precedes us. And you're saying, well, these other commissioners don't have this structure. Well, they don't. And the only ones who apparently are complaining are some vendors. And we'd like to hear who they are. We had Craig Dorn in here. Who asked him to come the last council meeting? Was that you?
I did speak to department directors to see if they could talk to any vendors that might be
Who asked Craig Dorn to
impacted.
come, if you know?
David Merriman. I asked Director Merriman to identify vendors.
Who asked Dave Wondolowski to come?
I did.
You did. And what was the purpose of you asking Mr. Wondolowski to come to our meeting?
To indicate the impact that these changes might have on vendors seeking to do business with the county.
Did you tell him that these changes perhaps would speed up his contract laborers being paid?
I did not say that.
Oh,
no.
okay. Did
It
you?
was about contracts in general.
Oh, so he didn't know the specifics. Okay, I didn't think so. You indicated that there were 15 days after we approve a contract that vendors get paid. You said that, right?
The 15-day statistic was between the invoice date and the actual date a check is cut. The average length of processing between when you approve a contract, which includes, again, execution of the legislation, execution of a contract, this all adds time. I don't want to make it seem like something gets introduced at council, it gets approved 2 weeks later, it's perfect.
That's what I understood.
That is not how our process works.
So our process with council takes 2 to 3 weeks. Once it gets to us, whatever precedes us and whatever's on the back end is the administration, right?
No. I would ask to look at what the deadline for legislation is, the deadline that county council has established for legislation, and include that in the length of time it takes to process. It's not as if we walk up the day of a council meeting and hand you an
It's a week
item.
before. What is the time frame you're indicating is a problem that you need to get us legislation?
The overall time.
I know, what is it?
If you're looking at the specific deadlines, I believe it's a week and a half prior to the council meeting that items have to be to the law department, and then the law department works with council on the legislation.
Okay,
So
so
it's
the
not as
problem
if
here
it's a day
lies, apparently, is that you need to get contracts in to get pre-approved through law before it comes to our body.
I don't know about pre-approval by law, that's just development.
Well,
of the
it has to go to law. Yes, it has to go to law, and you're saying, well, that takes up a week, maybe a week and a half.
It does, yes.
Okay, so the fact that we have contracts looked at by law, it takes too long, or the fact that it goes there at all takes too long. But once it comes to us, it takes 2 to 3 weeks. So do we look at that process? I think it's the process that precedes these contracts coming to us, and it's the process thereafter we approve them. And I think council needs to study that because the problem is not here at this body. It's what precedes us and what comes after, because we're not going to say contracts shouldn't go to law. And if you know it's going to take that long, then get it there 2 weeks before or 3 weeks before. Why aren't you doing that?
We're pushing departments to get items through as soon as possible. It's disingenuous to state that our process takes the same amount or equivalent amount of time.
Well, you told me
to
the law takes a week, week and a half, and we take 2 to 3 weeks to get it through here. So if you wanted to speed up, then I would suggest putting those contracts through the process sooner. And we understand it takes time. Everybody that comes before us explains that, and we give them grace, and we suspend the rules to get this through. So I think it's disingenuous to put this onus on us that somehow we're the creators of a problem when it's 2 to 3 weeks with us. But I think what I am happy to look at what precedes us and what comes after us to see if we can improve that. And when you asked, for us to explain, how do we explain to residents that it takes this long, 2 to 3 weeks to pay vendors? I would explain to the county residents that perhaps when we balance the scandal that we walked into and balancing out with oversight and processes, including the law department looking at contracts to prevent contract steering and corruption and those such things, I think the residents would probably lean toward it's better to have a little more oversight of contracts than going through a scandal. And it's not to put any kind of blame on a current administration, the last administration. Our job in 2011 was to put things in place to make sure that would never happen again. And the only people apparently who are getting hurt allegedly are vendors that we don't know who they are. So those are my statements. This doesn't fly with me. I'm happy to look at the process of the administration before something comes to us and when it leaves us.
Thank you, Councilwoman. We're going to give the last question to Councilman Martin Sweeney, and then we will end.
Thank you, Mr. President. We're in a hurry, but Paul, when you took this job, we were all excited. And you're going to fix it, right? You're going to try to make it more streamlined and make it work better because everybody knows if you ask how's the county work, it's not working that well. And I want to applaud you for the efforts that you're bringing to us. And this is the dialogue that we're having. See, I don't see the going around council because that's not your style, right? We're just trying to make it work. And I appreciate it. And we're not going to talk about it much more, but I have some questions, but I'm going to hold them because my council president asked me. But I just want to thank you for your efforts, man. I appreciate it.
Thank you, Councilman.
All right. Thank you. Thank you both. Did you want to have a final word?
Yeah, just to, thank you, Council President. Just to follow up, I know Director Porter had sent an email to council members asking for a few examples. This was sent out by Paul at the beginning of February with all of the supporting documents. If there's any additional documents that you may need, it sounds like maybe a timeline of the process might be helpful. But in addition to that, if you mentioned at the last meeting that you had vendors that were complaining about timelines, if you have examples of that, that would be helpful. It might be helpful to do a timeline of that particular process to walk through. So you could visually see from the beginning to the end, including the portion that Councilwoman Simon had mentioned on the executive end as well. Again, we're open to the changes from the beginning and the end. And this fiscal team that is meeting is looking at that from the start to the end. Thank you.
Thank you. All meetings of the Cuyahoga County Council are open to the public under the Ohio Open Meetings laws. Under that law, council may go into executive session during a meeting for specifically authorized purposes. During executive session, council confers outside of the hearing of the public. Council may not make any decisions about any matters in executive session. All decisions are made in public. This afternoon, the council will go into executive session for the purpose of discussing a collective bargaining matter and pending or imminent court action. During this time, our live stream will be down, and we ask all those not specifically needed for the executive session to remain in council chambers. Council members will convene in the adjacent Committee Room A and will re-enter the meeting once the executive session has ended. Is there a motion to go into executive session for the purpose of discussing a collective bargaining matter and pending or imminent court action?
So moved.
Second.
Moved and seconded. Will the clerk call the roll on the motion to go into executive session?
Mr. Gallagher? Mr. Schrein is absent. Ms. Conwell? Ms. Turner?
Yes.
Ms. Stevens is absent. Ms. Simon?
Yes.
Mr. Kelly?
Yes.
Mr. Miller?
Yes.
Mr. Sweeney?
Affirmative.
Mr. Byrne?
Yes.
Council President Jones?
Yes.
The motion carries.
Right. Meeting is adjourned. All right, we're officially back on the record, and our meeting is convened. Is there any miscellaneous business?
Nope.
If not, again, this meeting is adjourned, and we will reconvene at 5 p.m. For our regular council meeting.